Welcome to Grief in the Room. In this podcast, we do a deep dive into all things grief, so that when those themes of grief and loss show up in your client's story, you're prepared with the insight, tools, and most importantly, confidence to give them the kind of support they need. Grief in the Room is presented by Martin Ruddis and Trudy Bamford, grief trainers and advocates, and good friends. We bring warmth, humanity and humour to this subject, and we're so glad you're joining our conversation today. Please do subscribe to and say hello to us in the comments. What are we doing today, Trudy?
We're going to talk about the language of loss, which is a really important part of all of the grief education work that we do, is putting words to the different kinds of grief that may come up, that clients may present with. This is a really important episode because it's a grief education foundation, knowing the kinds of grief that people will be going through. Because grief is a very generic term, isn't it? But there are many different ways that people experience grief. So that's what we're looking at today.
You know what I find most interesting about this? People have light bulb moments when we explain some of these grief terminologies because they relate to them. Because many of us, there's such a societal perception about what grief is. And that's what we do in our grief training courses to really try and broaden knowledge and raise awareness, don't we?
Yeah. And, one of the really important messages that we're constantly trying to get over, whether that is in bereavement support or whether it is in training, is that grief is incredibly unique. It is not the experience that we see portrayed on television or films or in books. It is unique to each person. And I think one of the reasons why, when we look at the language of loss, it does create light bulb moments in people is because it names and by naming validates people's unique experience. They went through maybe a bereavement or a significant loss, like the end of a relationship, and they experienced it in a way that perhaps they don't feel other people experience it. And people internalize that then, don't they? And think, well, maybe I'm doing it wrong. Maybe I'm doing grief wrong. But when you can say, well, this is a common grief experience and this is the name for that, it's like, oh, okay, that was a real experience then. And then they own it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've chosen 6, and I know as well, some of the courses that we've put together recently, we've brought in a couple that we didn't teach at Cruise and you don't find often talked about. And again, those have resonated really strongly. And you've brought those in on the back of some personal experience and learning. And I think they've been really powerful, actually. So the first one, and we've not rehearsed this at all. It's typical elephants. It's unscripted. See how it goes. So the first one on my list, Trudy, is disenfranchised grief.
So disenfranchised grief is when somebody suffers a significant loss of somebody or something that's very, very important to them, but that loss is not acknowledged or recognised by those around them. So, for example, that could be pet loss. That could be something that is absolutely devastating, world-ending to somebody. And yet, because society has this sort of griefy Olympics grading system, those around them may well be, well, it was just an animal. It was just a pet. Get another dog. But the grief that they may feel could be as intense as any other kind of bereavement. That animal may have been their only secure attachment, their only experience of unconditional love, and people's worlds just fall apart after something like this. I was at the hairdresser's once, and she said to me, I had to take 2 weeks off work when my last dog died, but I had to tell everybody I had the flu because nobody was going to accept that I couldn't work for 2 weeks when it was just an animal.
Should we talk about some
You
other disenfranchised griefs?
Yeah, just thinking of our last episode, bereavement by drugs and alcohol, that is a prime example of disenfranchised grief. Again, because society's got this concept of a good death and a bad death. And certainly when somebody dies as the result of drug misuse or long-term addiction, substance misuse, that is not perceived in the same way as a death by other causes. Similarly, death by suicide sometimes can be disenfranchised grief. Because what we're talking about here is that you are experiencing an intense grief, but the people around you are either unable or unwilling to acknowledge and to support you in that grief. So the result of that is that people just they just internalize, don't they? They grieve in private, they grieve alone, because they're not getting the support around them, because their grief is it's being weighed up in the balance by people around them, and people are deciding how whether it's a worthy grief or not.
So they are disenfranchising someone's grief, aren't they? Yeah. Here's another take as well that has really hit home to me recently. As you know, I'm doing a lot of training with police and fire at the moment, services. And I've heard I've got some case studies together, and I've spoken to and spent time with some people who have experienced significant trauma, significant grief reactions. And they openly, and I don't need to name names, but they openly talk about the maladaptive practices that they undertook of drug, alcohol, misuse, just to function and to cope through the trauma and the PTSD. And the way they describe it is that, people knew that they'd had a tough time, but all they could see was the maladaptive practices of their grief. All they could see was the effects of their loutish behavior, their irritability, their short-tempered fuses, their excessive drinking or their drug taking. And again, their grief was disenfranchised even more so because of the way they chose. I'm not sure they chose, but the way their grief manifested with their behaviors. That's another very powerful example. So we're going to move on to anticipatory grief. So anticipatory grief occurs before an impending loss, typically the death of someone close due to terminal illness. Okay, well, that's quite an easy definition to wrap your head around. It can create a conflict between grieving the loss and hoping that they may still recover and survive.
But maybe we're talking about, referring back to the previous episode, your loved one is a drug user or an alcoholic. You will experience anticipatory grief. When I think of my brother, who was a heroin user, every time somebody knocked on the door, my mum thought it was the police coming to say that he'd overdosed. She suffered anticipatory grief for many, many years. However, alongside and as part of that anticipatory grief is the hope that as humans, no matter what situation we're in, there will be a little tiny spark of hope that things could change. So you're trying to marry these two opposing beliefs, that the person that you love, you're going to lose, but can you change that outcome if this happens? And you do see this with terminal illness too.
So, and typically the death of someone, but you're right, it's not just the death, is it? The way I describe anticipatory grief in the classroom, Zoom room, or to clients, I describe it as almost, if you think of a play with 3 acts, and the first act is when that ambiguous loss comes into a house, and let's say it is a terminal diagnosis, all of a sudden you mourn the past. You go straight back to the past and you mourn that time when you did not know, when you did not have this limitation, it was not around the table, it was not in the house. I've seen this happen so many times when cancer comes into a household. Everything starts to revolve around. But you almost lose your footloose fancy freeness because you didn't have to consider that thing, whatever it may be, dementia, that cancer, that so many lists that we could put into here. So all of a sudden you've lost some innocence. That's anticipatory grief. That's the past. In the present, Act 2, you've lost potentially, especially if there's an invasive treatment protocol, or you've lost mobility. And so, the present has changed dramatically because, again, you can't perhaps just eat what you want, go what you want, celebrate what you want, connect with your partner the way you like. And they're all losses. So that's the present. You can't just go on holiday because of treatment protocols and such things like that. And that really hit home for me when I was training Make-A-Wish Foundation, especially a fast-track wish where they put something in place to give the child, the young person, the wish, and then all of a sudden they can't. They can't go because now they can't leave the home, or now they can't leave the country, or they can't go away, or they can't do the physical activity that the granted wish. And then there's the future loss. That's Act 3. Because while all this is happening in the present, whether it be the person that is caring for that ill person or that terminally ill person, they are going to start to worry about the future, what's going to happen, the death that's going to come, how are they going to survive, or all the future losses that are going to occur. For example, anniversaries, birthdays, celebrations, and all that future loss of dreams as well comes into play and comes into fore. And then guilt and shame also come in because I'm thinking about me now, not thinking about my partner that's dying. So the future, anticipatory grief. Yeah. And Trudy, I think, would you agree that this is a grief that walks amongst us all the time and that we don't often recognize? And a lot of people then put their hand up and say, I had no idea, because nobody's died, especially work colleagues and things like that. A bereavement policy won't kick in because of anticipatory grief. And lots of people don't even realize they're experiencing anticipatory grief because, you just don't.
One of the reasons why it's really important to recognize anticipatory grief is because when a bereavement finally does happen, if it has been anticipated for whatever reason, it is likely that the bereaved person is already at an incredibly low ebb because all of their resources, all of their emotional, physical, mental resources will have been absorbed in trying to deal with the situation, trying to deal with the practicalities, trying to manage their emotions, trying to manage the emotions of the other person. And when the death finally happens, they're already at a really low ebb.
So one of the main questions we get after presenting this and talking about this as well is, okay, so if I've been caring for somebody and I'm anticipating that death because I know it's coming, it's a terminal diagnosis, does all this anticipatory grief that I'm experiencing help me the day that they die? Do I grieve less? The answer is no, because that conscious knowledge that they've died, I mean, you've been nursing them, or you've been there in their care protocols, and you've perhaps attended the funeral or been there when they died. So you've got that lived experience and that conscious knowledge. But the implicit knowledge is still equally ingrained and is as powerful, that they're everlasting. So gone, but also everlasting. That will still kick in with such a power that no, your grief reaction will still be very, very much present. And you will have your grief journey. I mean, who knows what your grief trajectory will be, because we don't know these things until we experience them. But just because you've had a degree of anticipatory grief in your life, no, it doesn't mean that it's going to all of a sudden be a better experience when they die. There may be a different route to acceptance or accepting smaller things, and it may be easier to build that conscious knowledge that they've died. You'll be able to connect the dots more, but the intensity of the grief will still be there, very much so. It's interesting. I remember a phone call on the helpline. Somebody was looking after their mother and had been for 4 or 5 years, terminal diagnosis of cancer. And she'd been looking after her mum for years, and she was she was really okay with it. But the time she called the helpline was the time when the cancer had spread to the brain and signs of it, the symptoms became dementia-like symptoms. She started to lose her mother's personality, all that kind of stuff, name recognition and relationship. That's when she hadn't experienced any grief, her words, not mine, up until that point when she started to then anticipate the demise of her mum because she'd lost parts of her mum's personality. So that was very poignant. That stays with me.
It's not just that you are anticipating a loss. You are already experiencing a loss in some way. You will have lost some part of the person or some part of the relationship or some part of the life that you had. So it's not that we are projecting ourselves into the future, and that's the anticipatory grief, although that is part of it. It's that we are grieving the losses that we are experiencing right now because of what is happening.
Okay. Should we do the next one?
So historic grief, you can also think of it as delayed grief. This is losses that have happened in the past that, because of circumstances or perhaps because of age, the grieving process was not completed or experienced fully at the time. This very often happens when somebody has lost somebody when they're a child, perhaps. And what happens is that our previous losses, they get activated by something in our present day history. That might be another bereavement, or it might be another significant life circumstance that activates the previous grief that had not been sort of completed, if you like. Not sure I like that language, but this is a really difficult one for people because it can feel incredibly confusing. So just to try and maybe think of an example, perhaps you're in a workplace and your colleague dies. You weren't particularly close to them, but you feel absolutely devastated and debilitated by the loss. And that can feel confusing. That can be confusing to the people around you. But what may be happening is that loss has touched a previous loss that is now bubbling up to the surface. So the feelings of grief that you are experiencing, yes, they will be in some degree related to the current day loss, but primarily they will be the historic grief that is now knocking on the door and saying, hey, I need some attention. I need looking at. Sometimes people get very, very distressed and grief-stricken when a celebrity dies. Sometimes this is part of the picture. This is part of the reason why. Because that loss and the grief that results from that loss taps in to previous losses and again brings them up to the surface where they require some tending and some attention.
So, and on that note, I remember when the Queen died, one lady phoned up on the helpline and she was angry. She was really, really angry. And her premise was, why has the world stopped for when his mum died? Because it didn't stop for when my mum died. And it was huge for her because it really brought the grief back into the present. I describe historic grief as grief has no respect of time or boundaries, and it has its own time machine. It will come from the past into our present, and then it will take us into the future in a heartbeat when that grief visits us. When we're small people, if we experience a bereavement, we may not be safe emotionally. We may not have the emotional intelligence. We may not be safe physically, for all sorts of reasons. We may be vulnerable, so we can't process that. So we pack up that grief and we lock it down. And we know as psychologists and counsellors today that to press down these emotions takes twice the amount of psychological energy that it does to help process our grief. Gabor Mate says that grief is an antidote to PTSD, because grief is a healthy process. It's not pathological. It's not an illness. And if we can process the grief and all the emotions in a safe environment, then we're not going to store them up to come back, and the potentiality of them visiting in the future is less so. When me and you did Understanding Your Bereavement for Cruz, Trudy, I clearly again remember a story of a lady, again my age, 50s, clearly talking about the death of her father, and she would not let any of her family members talk about it. There was no photos. She was suppressing the death of her father, who was, as she described him, as her best friend. And she was locking down that energy. And this was quite in the past again as well. And it was being brought into the present every time she suppressed a memory. She wasn't continuing bonds. She wasn't making meaning. She wasn't, it was that historic grief coming straight in. And it had been triggered, and she'd activated her grief, and she'd come to Cruz for support because of a contemporary bereavement. Because, as you've said, grief is compound, isn't it? It just, it's all interlinked.
Somebody that I supported through the trauma team, and it was a traumatic bereavement, a loss of a child that had happened more than 20 years previously. Everything in them was pushing the painful grief away because it just felt like it would swallow them whole. But the metaphor that I use with people is that it's like trying to push a beach ball under the water. You can keep pushing it down, but it's going to take a huge amount of energy, and it is going to keep rising to the top. No matter how many times you push it down, no matter how hard you push it down, it is going to keep coming to the top. So what do you do then? Well, you learn to swim with the beach ball. You learn to swim with it. And this is what we do with people with, in bereavement support, is it's helping them to exist alongside the grief rather than to keep pushing it down, pushing it away, because you can think that you're doing that successfully for a long, long time, but eventually you're going to run out of energy, or you may find yourself, and this is something that's important to acknowledge as therapists, you may find yourself finally in a place of safety that allows you. And this is something that will happen in the therapy room. Somebody may present and not even mention bereavement or grief because perhaps it's something that's happened a long, long time ago. So they're not aware that it's part of their process. But as you build up that safe, trusting, empathic relationship with them, that might be the first place that they feel safe. It's going to come bubbling up to the surface, and all of a sudden the grief's in the room with you. And that can be really unsettling for the client. It can be unsettling for you. But it just shows that you have now created that place of safety where that grief can now be looked at and examined and worked with.
That goes to the point of why we're doing this whole series, this Grief in the Room podcast, doesn't it? Because grief comes into the room, even if it's not been diagnosed, if it's not been assessed or identified, it just comes out, doesn't it? Okay. I would like you to lead with ambivalent grief because you have brought this to my attention and I love it.
I think of all of the types of grief that I share with people, this is the one that seems to resonate with a lot of people on a very deep level. So ambivalent grief is when somebody dies that you had a difficult relationship with. You may have been estranged from them. Perhaps it's a past partner, or it could be somebody like an abusive parent. Somebody who you would say, I'm glad that they're gone. I wanted them to die. And yet you experience a grief reaction. This is incredibly confusing and disorienting and distressing for people who may resent any kind of impact of grief when they've already perhaps suffered at the hands of this person. But What we have to understand is that if you had any kind of attachment bond to somebody, however long ago, however damaged that is, you are going to have some kind of a reaction when that person dies. It's going to be complicated. It's not by any stretch of the imagination going to be the same kind of grief response that perhaps a different kind of bereavement or loss might provoke. So it's going to perhaps be unrecognizable as grief, but nevertheless, it is a form of grief. You will have had completely opposing feelings about this person. At some point, you loved them, but you also hated them. You may have longed for them to go, thinking that that would heal you. And yet, after it happens, perhaps you find yourself still wishing on some level that they were still around. I have described this from my own experience. It feels like a kind of madness because you don't recognize it as grief. So you don't know what's happening to you. And I think this particularly affects people if it is a significant attachment figure like a parent. I have supported people who have come along to counselling because they have found themselves in a very distressed emotional state, perhaps with anxiety or depression. They did not link that up to a bereavement because as far as they're concerned, they're not grieving that person. They hated them. They were estranged from them. They never wanted to see them again. But clearly there is a link there to all these unresolved feelings. And if you've had a very complicated, painful relationship, you are going to have a complicated grief response to it.
These are not these different. We are splitting these up into different little parcels of language, but you could be experiencing ambivalent grief that's also historic, and your grief is also disenfranchised because nobody may have known what a terrible relationship you had with that person as well. So it could be disenfranchised, historic, and ambivalent. You know, this is not a you will experience this or this or this. It could be a very much so a you may be experiencing them all. And this is again what we really want to portray to our peers and our colleagues. You may be unpacking so many of these, which is why it's so important to understand the different aspects and natures of them.
And an important part of ambivalent grief is that you can grieve for the relationship that you should have had. So I'm thinking, for example, of when it comes to Mother's Day and Father's Day, it's splashed all over social media. That can create a real grief reaction in people that didn't have a good mum and didn't have a good dad. You can grieve for the person that you should have had and didn't have, and that can be part of that ambivalent grief reaction. Again, I think that comes a little bit back to that sense of hope that refuses to die in us as humans. As long as somebody is alive, even if it's only on an unconscious level, there may be a part of you that holds on to the tiny, tiny hope that it can be resolved, that they will say to you, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I treated you like that. Is there any way I can make it up to you? And you may get the person that you wanted, the dad, the mum that you wanted, or the partner. When they die, that hope dies too. You will never get the apology from them. You will never be able to maybe say the things that you now wish that you had said to them. You can't do that. So that is all part of the grief. So yes, you may not be grieving the presence of that person, but you will be grieving an awful lot more.
Not only does the hope die, but the anger can amplify as well. You know, that apology will never come. That behavior will never be, there'll never be that reckoning as well. So yeah.
This is a very, very important one for us to understand as therapists, because the person may not make the connection between the death and the struggles that they're having. They may not
Mhm.
accept you making that connection. They may resent you making that connection. But you do need to make a connection.
Yeah.
Regardless of how they say they felt about the person, regardless of what they say their response is to the death, it is likely that they will have been psychologically impacted by the death, not to say all of the stuff that had gone before it. So if you are supporting somebody and you are aware that there was a difficult relationship in their life and that person died, do flag that. Do flag that up, even if it's only in your own mind, that there will have been significant psychological impact to that death.
Well, this comes back to one of our other mantras as well, doesn't it, Julie? Never assume. And I know that's commonly tripped out, but we do not assume how someone's grieving and how the grief has impacted on them for this very reason. We should never assume, and we don't have to. We can ask questions. We can develop that therapeutic relationship and that bond and that working relationship and understand as opposed to just assume. So what we have now is we have traumatic grief.
So traumatic loss, this is something that I work with all the time because I'm on the traumatic loss team with Cruise Wales. This will happen as the result of a death that is sudden, shocking, unexpected, particularly if there are violent circumstances, perhaps a suicide or a road traffic collision. Perhaps it was witnessed by the survivor, or if the death was seen as preventable. So a lot of the clients that I support, the deaths are not as the result of an accident, but nevertheless, they are classed as traumatic loss because, as far as they're concerned, the deaths were preventable. Perhaps they feel that the hospital didn't handle it well, for example. It's to do with shock trauma, and traumatic grief is the result of a shocking death. And it has a massive impact on the survivors. It really, really does. Traumatic loss can affect people for decades. There's a huge amount of guilt involved in it, that they feel that they could have prevented it. There can be survivor guilt, particularly, I'm thinking, for example, when it is the death of a child, the siblings may well feel survivor guilt as they witness the devastating grief of their parents. And traumatic loss, it shatters somebody's assumptive world, which I know we're going to cover in a future episode, but that world in which we can live with some degree of certainty, knowing that our loved ones are going to be with us, knowing that perhaps life is somewhat in our control. After a traumatic loss, that gets blown to smithereens. It feels like nothing can ever be counted on, nothing can ever be secure ever again. And people become terrified then about the rest of their loved ones, because now it's like death is stalking them in a way. Now they know that somebody in a second can be gone. And also something that this can cause people to struggle with is their own mortality. When it has been a sudden, shocking loss, that really does bring home to people their own mortality. So they're not just dealing with the loss, they're not just dealing with the fear for their other loved ones, but they're now dealing with this huge existential fear that at any moment life can end.
If it is a traumatic grief, a traumatic loss, or a traumatic death, the ability to continually re-traumatize yourself, because it's one thing, and I've had this experience directly, it's one thing to, for example, be bereaved by suicide and to know that and to know how they did it, where they did it. But then it's another thing to actually read the coroner's report again and again and again. And that can just deepen the trauma. And we're already, trauma makes us so vulnerable, biologically, immunology, emotionally, physically, everything. It makes us so very vulnerable. So Yeah, I'd like to spend a lot more time on trauma.
We're going to do a full episode on this for sure. But I think one thing that I would like to just say before we finish this section, again, from the point of view of counsellors, therapists, if you are in the room, so that you don't have to wait until we do the full episode, something really important to keep in mind if you are supporting somebody who has suffered a traumatic loss is be incredibly sensitive to endings. They have been robbed of the opportunity of a proper ending with their loved one. So be really mindful of the way you handle endings. Stagger them if you can. Allow them opportunity to go through any unfinished business with you. They don't have that chance with their loved one. You give them the chance in the counselling room. And be bringing the thought of the ending to their attention long before the ending, so that you're softening the edges of it, so that it's not unexpected. If you don't remember anything else, just remember that. If it's a traumatic loss, be really, really sensitive around how you handle endings in the counselling room.
Yeah, thank you. Good point, Trudy. Yeah, I mean, we will. We're definitely going to unpack trauma, and so many times probably as well. Okay, so next one. So, prolonged grief disorder came into the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistics Manual. I don't know, I think it was version 5 or 6. I'm not sure which exactly, but it's a few years now. There's a lot of resistance because grief is not pathological, grief is not an illness, but it can become one. This is the way I normally explain it at a very superficial level. Some people argue that it was popped into the DSM in America so that the very monetized pharmaceutical and medical industry over in America could then all of a sudden start to help financially for grief, and that would help therapists and all sorts of other people. So a lot of resistance, a lot of positivity about it as well, because some people want that diagnosis and help. Because of the nature of prolonged grief disorder, they had to put prolonged into a time frame. That time frame they choose was 12 months and a day, but it's not that. So prolonged grief disorder is a trajectory, and it's how your grief is having the manifestations of it are having a significant impact upon your daily life, your ability to function, to look after yourself, to look after others, to work, to communicate, to, live a healthy life. So it's a trajectory, and we do know that one of the indicators, and there's so much work, and Mary Frances, Strobe and Schutt, and all the other grief greats around the world are all working on developing an understanding of prolonged grief disorder. There's a huge recognition of more work to be done to understand it. From Mary Frances' point of view, there's different brain structures that have an effect on and PGD. We know from the work that Strobe has done on rumination that a key indicator of prolonged grief disorder can be this mindless rumination, where just this constant, and Mary Frances talks about this in the Grieving Brain quite a bit as well, just this repetitive reliving of the experience, unable to reframe. And at those stages, definitely some form of psychotherapy and CBT has definitely been proven to be a helpful way of cognitive restructuring for prolonged grief disorder. And also something as simple as mindful rumination. And I think we're going to do an entire episode on rumination as well, aren't we, at some stage, Trudy? So prolonged grief disorder, it is very real. And again, so much more work being put into it to understand it. But the simple truth is, it's real, and it's very much, it can become an illness. Grief is not an illness, it's healthy, but it can become an illness, a diagnosable illness as well. Trudy, what do you want to say about prolonged grief disorder?
Yeah, I've got very mixed feelings about it, because whilst the concept of it is absolutely sound, and it is important to be able to create recognition for people who are struggling with intense, deep grief, a significant amount of time after the bereavement. The way that the framework has been created and that tiny time frame that they've put on it, I've got real trouble with that. If a mum loses their child and they are
Yep.
still deeply grieving 2-3 years afterwards, some would argue that is appropriate. So I think for me, it is the time frame element that I struggle with. But if we set aside the fact that the DSM had to put a time frame on it and just talk about the broad principles of it, then, it is a really important thing to acknowledge that some people are so significantly impacted by a death. And very often this will be kind of tangled up with traumatic loss as well. They are so significantly impacted that they are absolutely debilitated a very long time afterwards. Whether that is because they are consumed with it, or whether they are consumed with every effort not to think about it. That is, for me, that is the point of prolonged grief disorder, or some people will call that complicated grief. So a huge amount of research is currently being done and has been done looking at this very, very subject. And I think that in the next few years, we are going to see some huge strides in understanding when it comes to prolonged or complicated grief. But what we know so far is that there are certainly risk factors that may well predispose somebody to go on to developing prolonged or complicated grief after a loss. So this will be things like, if we think in terms of attachment and relationships, so perhaps there was a particularly dependent or particularly close or enmeshed relationship and one of them dies, or this person who has been bereaved, they don't have a support system around them. Perhaps they have experienced childhood trauma, or they come from a cultural context that maybe is not very supportive or doesn't really acknowledge grief. So these kind of interpersonal factors may well predispose somebody to have the risk of developing prolonged or complicated grief. Also, obviously, as we've spoken about, if it's a traumatic loss, if it is sudden, shocking, violent, a suicide, something that was witnessed, the trauma of that may well result in somebody going on to develop complicated or prolonged grief. And certainly this has been my experience supporting clients on the traumatic bereavement team. Many of these clients, the death happened a long time ago, but there's no, grief doesn't have a calendar, it doesn't care about that. But because of the sudden, shocking, traumatic nature, because they were so busy dealing with the trauma of what had happened, that then kind of complicates the grief reaction. And as we mentioned before, anticipatory grief, the way that pulls somebody down, so that after the death happens, they're already in a low resource state. Perhaps they have got serious issues themselves. They've got poor physical health. They've got mental health problems. They perhaps don't have good levels of resilience. They don't cope well with shocking changes, or they don't cope well with loss. And this is no reflection on people. We're all built differently. And also, we know that a bereavement particularly can really spotlight coping strategies, whether somebody has got a toolkit. A lot of us don't have toolkits. We never needed them. And then we turn to them because we're going through something and there's nothing there, or there's only, one thing there, like having a couple of glasses of wine at night. If somebody is experiencing a lot of post-bereavement distress and they don't have a toolkit of coping strategies and they don't have a support system around them, then these are other risk factors for them developing prolonged or complicated grief.
Okay. I think that is it.
Yeah, no, there's something else I want to say. So I think This has been a really valuable episode. I hope it has sounded valuable as you're listening to it. What I want to add as a caveat is, and this is the case whenever we're talking about anything to do with grief theory, these are descriptions, not prescriptions. We hopefully already know as counsellors, as therapists, that we are not diagnosticians. It's really useful to have this information, and it may feel appropriate to share with the person that you're supporting a little bit of an understanding. We know that psychoeducation is an important part of our work as supporters, but at the same time, and I'm just reflecting specifically on prolonged and complicated grief that we've just looked at the same time, it also isn't our place to diagnose people or to
No.
impose things upon them. We can offer things to people and say, you know, sometimes when people suffer this kind of loss, this is the impact. Perhaps we can certainly do that. And it's definitely important that we understand it. But we also do want to be cautious and make sure that it doesn't sound like we're telling somebody that they have got this kind of grief.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree very much.
And I'm going to add about historic grief. You know, we spoke about sometimes our grief gets activated in a surprising way. And it's important to acknowledge that that could happen for us as counsellors and therapists too. So we may find our own griefs, particularly historic griefs, we may find those being activated. So if you are supporting somebody who is grieving and you become aware that you've left their story and you're in your own grief, that is normal. Take it to supervision, be aware of it. And you may well need support with that as much as you are supporting your client.
Thank you for joining our conversation today. This episode of Grief in the Room was presented by Martin Roddiss and Trudy Bamford. Join us next time when we'll be talking about...
We're going to be looking at the neurodivergent experience of grief, because for the approximately 20% of the population that are autistic, have ADHD, any other form of neurodivergence, their experience of grief is going to be quite different from a neurotypical experience of grief. And the challenges that come up for them are going to be different. So as supporters, it's really important that we understand where the difference is and what they will need from us when it comes to support.